The morning was quiet and familiar, as always, until the word sounded, which made Maria's heart sink, and anxiety appeared in her chest, still unconscious, but already palpable. She was sitting at the table, sipping her morning coffee, when her husband Alexander suddenly and without preamble uttered these words, not noticing how they were poisoning the air in the room. "My mother is moving in with us." Maria froze. The cup of hot drink in her hand seemed to get heavier, and her brain could hardly process what she had heard. She looked at him, trying to figure out if she had been mistaken in her assumptions, if there was a joke in his voice, a slight irony that could explain such unexpected news. But no, nothing like that. His face was serious, his gaze focused, as if this was the most ordinary event in their lives. "What did you say?" "What is it?" she asked, unable to hide the confusion in her voice. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "We always talk about everything, don't we?" Alexander, continuing to help himself to his porridge, quietly replied. "It's all settled. Mom decided to move. She's going to live with us." Maria felt her hands clench into fists, and her eyes, perhaps, betrayed her inner storm. This turn of events was so unexpected and unpredictable that it did not fit into the usual order of things. Why the hell didn't she know anything? Why didn't they ask her how she would feel about it? What if she was against it? No, she couldn't let the house she had built with such hard work and love become strange and noisy, filled with strange sounds and unfamiliar habits. "Are you serious?" Maria couldn't believe it. Was this decision made without any discussion? "How is it? You didn't even consider it necessary to talk about it with me?" Alexander, as always, was calm, even too calm. He took a sip of coffee, looked at his wife with a strange expression on his face, as if waiting for her reaction, and said, "I talked to my mom. She really needs it. We have to help her." Maria felt something shrink inside her, as if her entire inner world was suddenly on the verge of destruction. Her calm, orderly world, in which she and Alexander had been building their future, was disrupted. Everything she knew, everything she was used to, had to change now. And it seemed that her life had become part of someone else's plan, in which her opinions, her feelings and desires did not matter. "But I'm not ready for this," she whispered, as if putting all her confusion and bewilderment into these words. "I did not think that we would have to face such changes." Alexander looked at her, and a shadow of indecision flashed in his eyes. He was an intelligent man. He always appreciated their world and family idol, but now, when it came to his mother, his world seemed to have shifted towards her interests. "It wasn't an easy decision," he said, and there was genuine concern in his voice. "But she's getting old. She can't live alone anymore. We need to support her. You know how worried she is about Victor." Maria pressed her hands to her head, as if trying to banish the growing pain, and was silent for several seconds. She knew that Victor, Alexander's older brother, had always been a troubled man. He was difficult and independent, didn't like working, and his whole life revolved around finding easy solutions. He was a special son to Elena, whom she could never refuse to help, and, most likely, this dependence did not stop with age. Maria remembered how many times Elena came between them and Alexander, tried to interfere in their lives, giving advice that no one asked for, and interfering in their relationship, as if unnoticed by herself. But now it was different. Elena wasn't just giving advice, she was going to move into their house, and it was more than just a change of scenery. It was an invasion of their personal space, their family world. And Maria could not understand how she would cope with this without losing her self-esteem and sacrificing the interests of others. Maria sat for a long time, staring at the dining table, unable to move. There were still disturbing thoughts in her head, and every time she tried to focus on a particular question, a new, more acute doubt arose. Her gaze slowly moved over the cup of cold coffee, but it did not reach clarity, not finding a solution. Sometimes her thoughts captured her completely, making her forget about space and time until her heart was filled with a crushing weight. Alexander, noticing her silence, decided that she needed an explanation, and continued quietly, with some tension in his voice. I know it may seem strange to you, but Mom just has no other choice. She's been alone for too long, you know, and she's starting to feel uncomfortable and anxious. Victor. He grimaced slightly, as if he had experienced something painful for a moment. And so, it will be easier this way. I am sure that this solution is the best for everyone. Maria turned her head to her husband, and her gaze accurately caught his gaze. She saw not only confidence in his face, but also a certain urgency, as if he had anticipated her objections, knowing in advance that she would be against it. She was prepared for the conversation to be difficult, but she hadn't expected this. Elena, with all her worries and problems, has always been at a distance. But now, if she moves, they won't just meet at some point on family holidays. Now she will become a part of their daily life, their habitual rhythm, interfering with its natural course. I understand everything, Maria said, choosing her words with difficulty, as if each of them required incredible efforts from her. But why should we? Why not try to find some other place for her where she will feel more at ease? Maybe she should look for something closer to her friends. She has friends and relatives. And anyway, I thought that you and I would solve such issues together. Her words hung in the air, but Alexander, without even thinking to soften them, just looked at her with some strange determination. She has relatives, but she doesn't want to live with them. And with friends. You know how she sees them. She doesn't say it herself, but it seems to me that she doesn't want to be a burden to anyone, and it will be easier for her with us. We are always there for you, we will always support you. Maria lowered her gaze, trying to hide her confusion from her husband. All these words about caring and support sounded like they were the only correct explanation, but for some reason they didn't calm her down. An inner voice wouldn't let her get rid of the premonition that this decision was not so much a show of concern as a hidden necessity. She was worried about how easily Alexander agreed to this step, without even thinking about the consequences for their life together. And she realized more and more that this step was not just his mother's decision, but something much more complex and multilevel. Are you really sure that it will be better for everyone? Her voice was a little quieter than usual, as if she was afraid of hurting him with her words. You know how difficult it is sometimes to get along in a small space. And not just with Mom, but also with Victor. Maria paused, as if giving these words a special weight. He's going to be with us. Alexander was silent for a minute, his eyes twinkled with a strange light. He probably didn't fully understand how strong this thought was for Maria, and now that it had touched Victor again, he felt that she needed to explain the situation once more. I understand that Victor is not the kind of person who is always easy with. But Mom asked him to be there. He can't live separately. You can see how he behaves, how difficult it is for him in this city. He can only recover in a familiar atmosphere. All this will be temporary, I'm sure. Maria noticed how Alexander quickly looked away when he said the last words. She understood that this conversation was not as easy for him as he was trying to show. He couldn't help but notice the shadow of dissatisfaction behind the words about Victor, and it wasn't easy for him to talk about him. For Maria, it was obvious that this was not just a request from her mother. It's a decision they made without discussing it with her, without trying to understand how she feels and how it will affect their relationship. Victor wasn't just Alexander's brother. For her, he always remained a stranger, whose actions and words caused only tension. Maria felt a wave of discontent rise in her chest again. Was her life going to depend on people with whom she had no particular desire to build relationships? These people, her mother-in-law and her brother, will be around her every day. And she had no idea how she would handle it. She stood up, trying to relax her tense shoulders, but the gesture didn't help. The tension still remained like an impassable wall. It was as if there were no answers to her questions, and doubts only accumulated, making it impossible even to calmly perceive what once seemed to be her cozy world. Evening came, and Maria seemed unable to find a place for herself. The house was quiet, but her thoughts, like restless waves, did not give rest. She was walking around the apartment, putting things in the closet, but every familiar detail of hers, the books on the shelves, the photographs on the walls, the cups on the table, suddenly seemed alien, somehow reinterpreted, as if she were looking at everything from the outside, with a completely new look. And every corner, every object in the room was now connected to a new question. How will it be with them? How will Elena live here, and how will Victor behave? Gradually, with each passing step, the tension became more and more palpable. It seemed that the very atmosphere of the house, which used to be warm and cozy, now became tense, like an invisible wall that separated her and her husband. There was this impassable barrier between them, their invisible disagreement. She was looking for answers to questions she couldn't put into words, but she still couldn't find relief. Circling endlessly around the room, she suddenly found herself thinking that she had created this question herself. What would happen in the future? Elena, with her vital energy, her worries, her desire to be needed, all this raised in her a strange feeling of anxiety that would not let go. But worst of all, she couldn't understand why she was so opposed. It's just a house, just a few new people she'll have to take in. Why can't she take it easy? When Alexander entered the room again, he was surprised at how Maria looked. Her face was tense, and her eyes were searching for an answer. He came up to her and put his arm around her shoulders, but she felt his touch and pulled away, as if it was too much. This gesture was not only physical, but also internal, as if she was increasingly shutting herself off from what seemed to be her own choice, but was actually made for her, without her participation. "You don't mind, do you?" Alexander asked, trying to clear the fog in her thoughts. He was in his element, always calm, always confident. But today, something in his tone betrayed that he was worried about himself. Apparently, he couldn't help thinking that Maria didn't share his point of view, that her worries weren't as simple as he'd thought. She barely looked at him, feeling the tension building inside her. Everything was so unexpected and unprepared that she couldn't fully comprehend how she could have made such a decision in the first place. Elena, of course, was Alexander's mother, and her help was always perceived as something natural, but now, when it came to completely interfering in their personal space, it was difficult for her to agree. After all, Elena was not just a woman who could be perceived as a guest. She aspired to become a part of their lives, perhaps not realizing how deeply she was intruding into their relationship. "Alexander." She began slowly, restraining her voice, which could betray her anxiety. "Do you understand that this is not just a matter of come and go? You and I have always lived together, in our own house, and now everything is changing. Are you sure she'll be comfortable here? And you and me?" He thought for a moment, but then, as usual, he gave her an answer that seemed to dispel all her doubts. He was sure he was right, and that's why he spoke so calmly. "I know it's not easy, Maria. But she's not just going to live with us. It's temporary until she settles in a new place, until she finds her place in life. You know it's hard for her to be alone. Victor, to be honest, won't help. Besides, Mom worries anyway, and we, as a family, have to be there for her." But Maria couldn't calm down. Her gaze, full of unspoken feelings, lingered on his face for a moment, but it was firm and puzzled. Each of his answers, although it seemed logical, did not relieve her inner sense of confusion. Maria could not understand why she seemed to be so easily putting her life at the disposal of strangers. There were too many unanswered questions. "But I don't want this to become the new normal," she finally said, restraining herself, trying not to let her emotions get out. "It's not just living with us. This means that we will have to rebuild everything. You do understand what's going to happen between us, don't you? We won't be able to stay the same as before." Alexander fell silent again, feeling for a moment as his own calmness began to fade, and anxiety took its place. But despite everything Maria said, he couldn't imagine another reality. He was sure that the family should be close, that it would be better for Elena to live in their house than to look for someone else who would accept her without question. He was sure that everything would be resolved, everything would be settled, and they would find a common language. He wanted to believe that time would solve everything. "You're thinking about it too much, Maria," he said, holding back a faint smile. "We'll manage. We've always managed, haven't we?" Maria looked at him and felt something break inside her. She didn't know if she would be able to get used to living with strangers, to their views and habits. But despite all her resistance, at some point she realized that the situation would change and she would have to learn to live with it. "I don't mind, Alexander. But I'm just not ready for that. You do understand, don't you?" There was no response. The words remained unspoken, but Maria felt a cold silence descend on them. A dark autumn morning burst into the apartment like an uninvited guest. A fine rain drumming monotonously on the windows obscured the light in the house, and Maria, standing at the window, could barely distinguish its smell and feeling, which had once been her family. All these familiar details, so beloved and cozy, now became alien to her, as if she had accidentally found herself in a strange world, surrounded by objects and memories that no longer made sense. She stood looking out at the wet streets, and the same questions were spinning in her head, to which she could not find an answer. What to do with this new reality? How can she move on when her home, her space, and her personal life are becoming more confusing and stressful every day? Maria did not understand when and how she became so sensitive to these changes. Maybe from the very beginning, when she first heard that Elena was going to move in with them. Or maybe it all accumulated gradually, starting from the moment when she did not receive proper participation in a decision that affected not only her, but also her life. It seemed that everything in her relationship with Alexander was predictable, calm, and now suddenly something broke, not that fatally, but as if an invisible crack had passed through their entire house, through everything that she considered her own. Remembering everything that had happened, she felt something gnawing at her from the inside again. And there was no comfort, no matter how hard she tried to calm herself down. The fussy internal struggle between what she was comfortable with and what she was forced to accept did not stop. Whenever she closed her eyes, her imagination would once again paint their new life in colors, a life that could suddenly become a stranger to her, filled with superfluous people, their views and habits that would certainly invade her personal territory, forcing her to lose her familiar world. She had imagined more than once how she would share the kitchen with them, how Victor's gaze would loom around every corner, how her mother's care would cover them over again. She couldn't get rid of this picture, and every time she tried to focus on something else, her mind would return to these scenes. Alexander's words, which calmed her yesterday, did not give her any comfort. On the contrary, their strong, confident statements that everything will be fine seemed more and more empty and unconvincing to her every time. She couldn't understand how, without asking her opinion, he could make a decision so calmly. It wasn't just a matter of practicality or caring for a mother. It was an intrusion into her personal life, into their world, and that world was sacred to her. That night, before falling asleep, she lay in bed, looked at the darkened ceiling and thought that her life would never be the same. Elena, her husband, Victor, all these figures had now become part of her daily reality, and the thought of living in the same house with them seemed almost unbearable to her. Is she really going to take part in this battle for a space where there will be no place for her inner harmony? Does she really have to restrain her emotions now, hide her thoughts in order to please these people who will live in the same house with them? She couldn't understand it. And worst of all, she didn't know how to avoid it. Maria was tormented not only by these reflections. Images of her and Alexander's life before that surfaced in her head, when they were just the two of them, when her voice and her desires were important. Victor, this mysterious and somewhat gloomy man, did not make her feel comfortable around him. He wasn't angry or aggressive, but something about him seemed so alien that Maria couldn't imagine how she could get used to his presence in the house. He always looked distant, self-absorbed, and his silence was much more difficult for her than verbal attacks. But the worst part was that she couldn't find a foothold for her thoughts. She talked to herself many times in her mind. Is it really that important, Maria? Shouldn't you take matters into your own hands, make it easy? But every time she tried to find confidence in her own words, the doubts returned like shadows in the night, suddenly intrusive, unyielding. The next morning, once again faced with the inevitable, Maria realized that she could not continue to be under pressure, hiding her feelings, pushing them into a corner. She knew she had to tell Alexander what she was thinking, but how could she do that without ruining everything to the end? How could she tell him that her anxiety wouldn't go away on its own, that her inner world had already been destroyed by this decision? She didn't want their relationship to become a battlefield, but she felt that every step, every silence on this issue, was tearing her soul apart even more. Again that evening, when Alexander returned home, she decided to approach the issue not with emotions, but with prudence. But her voice, no matter how hard she tried, was trembling. The words came out with difficulty. You do understand, Alexander, that I can't just accept everything. I need time. I need to figure out how I'm going to live with this, how I'm going to interact with your mom, with Victor. I need to understand how this will affect our lives. He sighed, holding back his tiredness, but it was clear from his look that he was worried that it was not easy for him. He approached her, but this time he did not try to comfort her with words. He just hugged her, as if trying to gather all her doubts and worries in his arms, hoping that this would help. But Maria felt their space narrowing, as her boundaries were being violated more and more, and in this embrace she did not feel as protected as before. We can do this, he whispered. But his words couldn't calm her down. Overcoming a momentary feeling of helplessness, when every movement and word seemed inappropriate, Maria, as promised to herself, decided to try to understand the real reason for this incomprehensible turn of events. An increasing number of unanswered questions were piling up in her head, forming like a thundercloud that would not let her rest. What is behind Alexander's decision? Why did his mother suddenly turn out to be so persistent in her intention? Why did he so easily agree to this change in their lives? These questions needed to be resolved, and Maria, despite all her internal struggles, realized that she would not be able to leave them unanswered. Elena, a person with a pronounced sense of responsibility for her family, with whom she had repeatedly shared in her conversations, seemed to her an increasingly unknown and strange person. She had long since disappeared from her ideas as just Alexander's mother, and in her perception she became a symbol of something much more complex than it seemed at first glance. Not just a woman trying to take care of her sons, but a whole layer of habits, worries, and hidden intentions that are now persistently invading her home. But what exactly is she hiding? Maria tried more than once to remember what had connected her with this woman up to that moment. In fact, their relationship never went beyond general conversations, superficial conversations about the pursuit of success and everyday worries, without touching on deeper topics. In her eyes, Elena was a model of a strict but at the same time attentive woman. She did not stand out as a bright personality, but every year her images became a little brighter, and her words became more meaningful. Being in her house, there was always a special atmosphere, a little dry, like the air in an empty room. Everything was in its place, there was no place for randomness and chaos. But now, faced with a decision that seemed to overwhelm her entire life, Maria was trying to figure out what motivates a woman whose motives she could not fully understand. She knew that talking to Alexander would not be able to get a clear explanation. He has already expressed his opinion, but the answer to the question of why this happened has not been voiced. He himself was not able to figure out what exactly caused this step, but most likely, he was guided by one simple and understandable consideration for him: family duty. He was ready to accept the help that, in his opinion, his mother could offer him, forgetting about how it would affect his family. But for Maria, this step was like pushing a stranger into a cramped room, who would begin to take over her space, becoming a part of her day, her evening, her thoughts. It didn't seem right to her. And more importantly, she couldn't believe that this move was motivated solely by good intentions. There was more to it than that, perhaps ulterior motives that, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't figure out. Remembering Alexander's words that Mom just wants to be closer, Maria asked herself another question. Why didn't Elena try to support them earlier when they were buying an apartment? Why, being in different circumstances, did she not offer her help? And suddenly it became clear, it wasn't just a desire to help her son, it was her plan to create better conditions for Victor, her eldest son. Despite the fact that Victor had long ceased to be a part of their family, his problem remained unresolved. Deep down, Maria knew that Victor was for her mother the one she thought about every day, the one she pinned her hopes on. And now, when the situation with his future was bothering her, she decided to step in. She wanted to do everything to make it easier for him to adapt to the big city, where he seemed to have never found his place. And so, in order to possibly help him find a new path, she made a decision. She saw it not only as caring, but also as her own ambitions. Maria could hardly believe such motivation. After all, a simple truth was obvious to her. If you want to do something for your loved one, you don't do it in such a way as to infringe on another. However, in fact, Elena did not think of Maria as an independent person. She did not take into account that her actions could cause pain, that her interference in her life with Alexander destroys not only her inner balance, but also the atmosphere of their relationship. With every passing hour, it became clearer that the reason for her behavior might not have been simple kindness, but only a desire to consolidate her role in her son's life, to create conditions for him that could compensate for all those unfulfilled hopes and dreams that she had accumulated over the years. But despite this understanding, Maria could not calm down. With every minute she spent waiting for them to move in with her, her anxiety grew. She still couldn't calmly look at the image that appeared in her head, Victor, an insecure man who, perhaps, would have become someone who would always be at hand in her place. The very idea that he and his mother would have to share a space with her seemed like an ordeal, too difficult for her. Maria sat on the couch for a long time, lost in thought, and at some point she was overcome by a feeling of fatigue, as if her energy had been exhausted not only by worries about the house, but also by heavy thoughts. She couldn't stay in this unknown situation any longer and didn't know what to do next. But she understood one thing, one way or another, she had to accept the inevitable. And the question was not how it would happen, but how she would learn to live with this decision, which seemed to change her life forever. The evening came unnaturally quickly, and with it came a strange feeling, as if every moment was stretching out, as if the clock had slowed down, giving her time to scroll through another wave of disturbing thoughts in her head. Maria was sitting at the kitchen table, examining a cup of cold tea. Everything seemed the same. The view from the window did not change, not even the usual way of life did not change, but everything was changing inside her. Somewhere inside there was a feeling of pressure from which she could not hide even in the shadow of the most mundane affairs. It seemed that every corner of her house was already occupied by something alien. It had long been rearranged, redone, and there was no longer room in it just for her and Alexander. This alien invasion was beginning to take tangible forms, and Maria kept trying to figure out where its boundaries were. Alexander had already returned from work, but his gaze was the same as always, a little tired and slightly clouded, as if he, immersed in his worries, did not notice what was going on around him at all. He didn't have enough time to realize that he and Maria were already on the verge of change, that from now on their lives would be tilted at a threatening angle, turning in a direction that until recently seemed unattainable. It happened so often in their relationship. She felt that she was being given responsibilities that no one dared to take on, and it had already turned into a kind of ritual, forcing her to be by her side, always by her side. "Alexander, what are we going to do with the kitchen?" she asked quietly, unable to hide the doubt in her voice. The question, like her mood, was not just a question, it was almost a warning, as if she was not just interested, but also trying to look into the vague future, to predict how everything would end. As always, her expectations were dashed by his disinterested gaze. He sighed, rubbed his temples with his palm, and Maria noticed how the tension from this answer, oppressive but implicit, began to manifest itself more and more clearly. He didn't seem to know what to do himself. It wasn't that they would get along, it was understandable, but perhaps not the most important condition. It was important who would cook, who would put their things when and where, who would occupy all these corners that had previously been just their space. Well, we'll live somehow. Everything will fall into place, he replied, looking at her with such doom that for a moment she even felt how his words, rather empty promises, became a cold rain on her inquisitive questions. Saying that everything would fall into place did not explain what she should do with this new inescapable presence that was becoming part of their home after all. And her uncertainty about how all these everyday things would go was getting worse. Elena, a person who has always lived by her own rules, not encouraging changes in her life, will now deal with the very little things that she so fiercely tried to control in others. And Victor, as the inexorable companion of these changes, will be sitting at the same table, meeting her gaze from behind the same table, like a man whose existence she has always tried to forget. With every passing hour, Maria felt more and more like her personal space was disappearing. If earlier there had been only her and Alexander's kingdom here, now it seemed unacceptable to forget that 2 more people would soon live in this kingdom. She could imagine how the morning would go. Everyone would sit down at the table, and she would have to try to adjust to these new rules, which had not been agreed upon, had not been discussed, and which so unacceptably interfered with the usual course of her day. She got up and went into the kitchen. Lost in her thoughts, she no longer heard Alexander's footsteps, did not feel his presence. Images from the past surfaced in her head, those very moments when she and Alexander were still young, when the house was filled only with their laughter and contentious conversations. Elena never intervened, did not give advice. But now she would be with them, and Maria couldn't help but recall how several times in recent years she had felt her presence in the most unexpected situations. Always pointing out mistakes, shortcomings, showing excessive care and attention that were not always welcome. Sometimes Maria even felt that her every glance, every advice could destroy the comfort and harmony that she and Alexander had worked so hard to build. "Alexander, are you sure everything's going to be okay?" she asked, turning to him, unable to hide her worries anymore. His reply came late. The words he said seemed disappointing and helpless to her. "Yes, I think everything will be fine," he said, smiling at her from the table. But there was no confidence in that smile, and Maria saw that her worries and doubts were also familiar to him. Seconds later, her thoughts returned to Elena and Victor, and she noticed with annoyance how her image began to fill the entire room. It wasn't just an invasion, it was a sense of inevitability, a weight of presence that couldn't be avoided. And now she and Alexander had to somehow get along, adjust to this new future, which was not so clear and easy. And although Maria didn't fully realize it, it was then, in the kitchen, on the eve of what was about to happen, that she began to realize that her life would never be the same again. The morning greeted her with the dim light of the autumn sun, which, breaking through the veil of clouds, hardly penetrated into the room, as if not daring to interfere with the events taking place in this house. When Maria woke up, she felt the tension of the previous day coming back like a wave. Time seemed to shrink, and before she could really come to her senses after the night's thoughts, Alexander was no longer there. He left for work without asking a single unnecessary question. This morning there was no lightness, there was no habitual freedom, because she knew what was coming today. Everything was happening too fast, the changes were too acutely felt, and every moment, every breath in a house full of bustle, became part of this unbearable preparatory work. Tasks, like shadows, menacingly followed her, and somewhere inside, this heavy anxiety did not subside, which would not let go. The same questions kept running through my mind, but there were no answers. As soon as she went down to the kitchen, her gaze fell on the mess, as if the morning itself was some kind of deception. Cups, countertops, a floor that had not had time to lay a carpet. The very layer of dust that she hadn't noticed before suddenly became an irritating factor, as if it were a reminder that there was much more to do than just cook. She couldn't afford to relax. Elena and Victor were supposed to arrive in a few days. This thought hung in the air like a thundercloud. The very thought that she would have to make room for these new people, to make them take their place in the house and in her life, caused panic reactions. What if there isn't enough room? What if she can't please everyone and find a compromise? Elena, as always, will monitor every step, assessing what is done correctly and what is not. Maria went to the phone and dialed Alexander's number, even though she knew he would be busy. He was always busy. It had never happened that he devoted enough time to household chores. Everything in their family was somehow on the run, everything was temporary. There was no answer, and Maria sighed, passing the kitchen window again and trying to find some kind of peace in this emptiness. She was familiar with this feeling, the feeling of being overloaded, when everything starts demanding attention, and you don't have time to react to everything at once. She went to the cupboards, as if expecting to see not just empty shelves and supplies, but clear instructions on how to put this house in order so that everything was perfectly prepared for arrival. Cleaning is one thing, but freeing up space and making changes to the established order is quite another. She was beginning to feel like everything, every object that had previously been just a part of her in Alexander's cozy world, was now becoming part of a space alien to them. It was something new they had to be learned to put up with. Remembering that she needed to clean up the bedroom, she headed to her room. Everything was as usual here, quiet, calm, but still something was wrong. This room, like her life, seemed alien. A slight sadness came over her when she saw the light burning restlessly in the corner, where there was a box of books that had not yet been disassembled. She couldn't just leave it as it was, couldn't pass it by. Maria felt that now she had to somehow build a new order on her own, so that this change would not destroy their entire house. It was necessary to fill the void that had formed with something. Tears of impotence welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She knew she had no right to give up. Several hours passed like that. Sorting through the boxes, Maria already began to feel that her tired, agitated spirit was calming down a little. She began to arrange books and things the same way as before, trying to regain at least some of the lost comfort. But then the doorbell rang. Her heart skipped a few beats in surprise, and she glanced uneasily at her watch, deciding that it was probably someone from her family. She went to the door and opened it. In front of her stood a young guy with suitcases. It was Victor, Alexander's son. He stood with his head slightly bowed, and despite his confident pose, there was something indefinable on his face that made Maria feel uncomfortable. "Hi, Maria," he said, and his voice was somehow soundless, as if he was experiencing the same tension as she was. Victor, with whom she had always kept her distance, now, oddly enough, seemed a bit of a stranger to her. He dropped his bags in the hallway and, apparently deciding not to linger, headed towards the room. Maria stood in the doorway, not knowing what to say. At that moment, it became clear to her that she doubted Victor not only because of his behavior, but also because now her life would completely change. She was like a stranger, standing on the threshold of changes that seemed frightening to her. "Don't worry," Victor said, looking around the room. "We will not interfere. We'll just get used to it a little bit." She didn't say anything, but something about those words, about his calmness, made her feel relieved. But only for a moment. Everything was too fast to take it for granted. However, she decided not to escalate the situation yet. Victor was in the house, and maybe it wasn't as scary as she thought. With every step he took through the house, Maria felt the space becoming more alien, but somehow coming to terms with it. It was no longer just an invitation to change, it was an inescapable feeling that everything should be different now. It's been a few days since Victor and Elena entered their home and became an integral part of it. Maria, despite her fatigue, could not get rid of the feeling that her life had turned into an endless stream of organizational details, which greeted her with a new charge of anxiety every morning. She was used to the fact that she was always the mistress of her house. She could always decide what this world would look like, how events would develop. But now, with the arrival of these people, everything has changed. The house was no longer her personal refuge, where she could come after a long day at work and find peace, her corner. Now everything has become a common arena in which her desires and comfort have given way to other people's worries and habits. In the early days, she noticeably avoided direct conversations with them, referring to the fact that there was a lot of work, that she needed to collect documents, arrange things. Sometimes, when she passed by the kitchen and saw Victor, they exchanged neutral phrases that concerned only everyday life. Despite all his efforts, he was still a stranger to her. She noticed him sitting at the table, silently picking at his plate, glancing at her as if waiting for some kind of answer. But there was no answer. She didn't have the energy to start a dialogue either. Elena, on the contrary, seemed to sense this barrier and tried to make Maria feel at least verbally important in a new situation. She offered many times to help her with cooking, washing, and some small household chores, but Maria, although she tried to appear friendly, answered in monosyllables, making these suggestions bounce off her like oncoming waves. She felt that in this way she was trying to protect herself from someone else's intrusion into her personal life. Everything around her, despite Elena's efforts, was not the same as before. It seemed as if the new residents were absorbing the space, filling it with the sounds of other people's conversations, footsteps, and smells. All of this was gradually consuming her, leaving her in a void she couldn't handle. One day, when Maria returned from work, she found her in the kitchen. Elena was standing at the stove, her hands moving habitually while cooking dinner, and her face was serious and focused. She looked at Maria with a slight surprise, as if she had just noticed her presence. "Are you worried about something, Maria?" Elena asked quietly, but with such sincerity that Maria almost did not notice this question. "You don't like it when strangers come into the house, it's okay." Maria looked at her in confusion. These words somehow surprised her, breaking the usual distance between them. How could she understand her feelings so accurately? How could she be so perceptive? The feelings she had been holding back with all her might suddenly became apparent, like hidden thoughts bursting out. "It's simple." She paused, and her voice cracked. "I just wasn't ready. It's all so sudden. I thought it would be different." Elena nodded gently, not expecting a quick explanation. Her gaze became a little softer. She took a step towards him. "Do you think I don't understand? I once found myself in a similar situation. When Victor grew up, when he went to Moscow, at first I felt such emptiness, and then I realized that it's impossible to live alone, that I need to find new connections somehow. And now you, and Alexander, your home has always been important to me." "It's important to us," she said softly, smiling slightly, but there was still some deep understanding in her words. Maria felt this slight openness cause her inner wall to weaken a little. She put down her bag and sat down at the table. Elena continued to work at the stove, but Maria suddenly felt that not all the help from these people was aggression. It might just be a different way of caring, not at all like her own. "I do not know how to deal with this," she finally said, panting from the unexpected frankness. "I'm used to being independent, I'm used to controlling the situation. And now it's like someone has invaded my personal world." Elena put down the frying pan, turned around and looked at her with amazing gentleness. "I understand you. You know, Maria, not everything needs to be controlled. I want you to understand that your space remains yours, as well as your relationship with Alexander. You will still be the main mistress of this house. We're not here to ruin your life, but to be there when you need us." Maria was silent, but her gaze became more confident. Elena seemed to feel that her words had found a response. She went back to her business, and Maria thought about it. There was a complicated tangle of feelings in her heart, and until now, she believed that this invasion was completely impossible for her. But what if it's not as bad as she imagined? Maybe this change will not only deprive her of her personal space, but also give her something new? A new relationship, a new opportunity to be a part of something bigger than herself? Dreams of her own space, independence, and a familiar life still remained in her thoughts, but now, after talking with Elena, she began to perceive this situation as something she needed to learn to live with. Maria, as if feeling the tension building up inside her, reached for a cup, carefully looking at the table. There was no turning back. Time was passing, and now she had to accept the fact that her life would never be the same again. But perhaps this is not the end, but only the beginning of a new stage,